Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us at this bright blue event, Bigger and Better, reforming the private rental sector. Thank you very much for coming on this Tuesday morning. I hope everybody enjoyed yesterday. If this is your first Bright Blue event, then welcome. If it's not your first Bright Blue event, then welcome again. My name is Bartek Staniszewski. I'm the head of research at Bright Blue, the center-right think tank for defending and improving liberal society. And we are joined today to discuss policy in the private rental sector by, to my right, to my immediate right, Lord Baron Jamieson, OBE, the Shadow Minister for Housing, Communities and Local Government and the opposition whip in the House of Lords. To his right is Tom Darling, the director of the Renters Reform Coalition. Then to my left, we have Neil Garrett, who is the London Assembly member for Croydon and Sutton, and until May was the leader of London Conservatives. And then to his right, we've got actually not Nathan Emerson, but Timothy Douglas. Did I say right? Yes. You know what I meant. And then to his left is Timothy Douglas from Propertymark, and we will be joined later on by Henry Hill as well. Vicky Spratt was supposed to join us. I do apologize; she is not able to make it, which also makes the gender balance of this panel a little bit off. But I will try to make up for that and perhaps say some of the things that Vicky might have said. Anyway, to begin, perhaps. I suspect if you're here, you are aware of some of the problems that the private rental sector in the UK has been facing. Properties are getting smaller. There's way more renters than there's properties that are available to let, especially in high-demand areas in London, especially in areas where productivity is really high and where we need people, where we need people to be mobile, where we need people to be able to move in to boost growth. Young people are unable to get properties of the right size, so they're not able to start families, and an increasing proportion of young people's incomes, partly because of rising rents, partly because their own incomes aren't increasing at the same pace that they used to increase. An increasingly large proportion of young people's incomes are being taken away by rent, which leaves them with little money to spend on other things. And this is not just young people. There's increasingly many older people as well stuck in the private rental sector, people who have no hope of ever moving out of it. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact percentage, but the majority of people in the private rental sector have no hope of ever leaving it, of ever purchasing a house. So to begin, Lord Jamieson, what's the cause of all those problems, and how do you go about solving them?
So, the fundamental problem is we have a housing crisis in the UK. We have more people than we have homes for them, and we need to do something about that. And if you look at the CPS think tank, they did some work and they reckon compared to a number of European countries, we have 6 million fewer houses than we ought to have for the population that we have. And that leads us to the ridiculous point where it is so hard to get on the housing market, where it's typically taking 10 times your gross income to buy a house. I remember when I bought my first house, it was 3.5 times my income. It was a nice little 2-bed in Luton, and it was affordable to me. Interest rates were a little bit high at that time. But that means that the typical first-time buyer is 34. I was privileged. I did it at 24. And that's why we have so many problems in the housing market, and we have things like 350,000 people living in temporary accommodation, more than half of whom are in London. And London is a particular issue in the housing market. And I'm looking forward to Neil's comments on that. And that's spilling over to the rental market, and you're probably all aware of these facts. The average rent is £1,400. In London, it's £2,200. That is 50% or more in London of people's net income. It's simply unaffordable. And if you look to the general research, if you're around about 30% of your net income, that is deemed a not unreasonable proportion of your income, something that allows you to spend on the rest of the necessities of life. Now, from 2015 to about 2021, real rents were declining slightly in the UK and in London. Since 2021, we have seen a marked increase in real rents, and last year, the figures up to, I think it's May, 5.9% increase in the UK, 6.3% in London. It is just going up too much, and at the same time, we're seeing the attractiveness of renting your property going down. And so Rick's latest figures in July show a dramatic decrease in the number of listings of rental properties. So we end up with a situation which you alluded to. We have high cost rental, we don't have enough rental, and we don't have security of tenure. The market is not working because there is not enough property available for renters or for buyers. And we're having more people needing to rent because they can't get on the market. Now, the private rental market clearly has a role to play, but it shouldn't be there because people can't afford to buy a property. If you want to buy a property, it would be great if you're able to buy one and release your rental property. Now, if you look at things that might actually work, in the 1990s and the late 80s, the Conservative government reformed, deregulated and freed up the private rental market. That meant in the 20 years after that, we had a doubling of the share of properties that were private rental. And that's got to be a good thing, having a greater supply. The one comment I do get from some people is, well, if we had fewer private rentals, then they'd have to sell it, and therefore the property would be cheaper. Housing is not a zero-sum game. There is a real market for things like buy-to-let and whatever, which will enable more property to be built. So it is important that we make it attractive to investors to have private rental in order that there's a supply for people who actually want to rent. And I'll come back to the fundamental. I just said we want a market which is, you secure, a reasonable rent and so forth. Every good landlord wants a good tenant. Every good tenant wants a good landlord. Our problem is that we have rogue landlords, and if we're honest, there are a few tenants who aren't quite perfect.
Everybody agrees. There's far more rogue tenants than rogue landlords.
Whichever way. So the bit I want to talk about was how do we encourage people to invest more in the private rental market so there's more availability. And so I'm probably going on too much. And we'll come back to this maybe a bit more, but we have this current Renters' Rights Bill. And my concern is that is moving the balance so far in one direction that it's great if you're in a property, you will have greater security and protection as a tenant. Good. However, it is risking making the market so unattractive to investors that they will be going, you know what, I'm not going to take the risk. I will not invest in this market. And I'm certainly hearing a lot of international investors that are saying, I cannot get the returns that I need to invest in rental property. And that will mean less supply. So I'll come on to some further comments later, but we need a balance in the market.
Thank you very much. And some selling points there on the Renters' Rights Bill, which we'll get back to later. But for now, I wanted to move on to Neil. And Neil, being a member of the London Assembly, obviously the problems with the rental sector are particularly bad in London for some of the reasons we've alluded to earlier. And I think in this circle, a lot of the blame often goes towards Sadiq Khan and towards the London plan. And I was wondering, is the problem to do with the plan itself, or is it to do with the way that it's being delivered?
Well, morning, everyone. It is actually both. So this is the interesting thing. I call it the Mad Hatter's Tea Party that we call the property market. Specifically, to pick up on some of the figures about London. So this is why it's both a particular issue and for an issue for us as a party, because a majority, unlike the rest of the UK, a majority of households in London are renters. And because the owner-occupiers in London are predominantly older, actually working-age Londoners overwhelmingly are renters. So if we as a party don't have something good to offer to them, it's quite reasonable that when we ask them to offer us their vote, it's not forthcoming. And we have seen, although it has abated a bit this year, we've seen 2 years back-to-back, something like 10% annual rent increases. Not many people really. Amy LeMay for a while was getting pay rises that would keep up with that. But most normal Londoners, they're just falling way behind. It's a sort of vice-like crush on the cost of living. If you're a London council taxpayer, I don't know how many of you are, but 11% of London council tax in total goes to tackling homelessness. It's about a £2 billion a year bill for London councils. And in terms of children in temporary accommodation, about one child in every London classroom, in every school, in every year group, is in temporary accommodation. The human cost of this thing, from older London professionals to children growing up in London, is appalling. the reason I say it's a Mad Hatter's Tea Party is because none of the words that we use about this mean what they seem to mean. And none of the numbers add up. And it all just seems to carry on regardless. So in particular, I want to focus on this term affordable housing. Okay? If I could do one thing, if I ruled the world for 2 minutes, I would ban the words affordable housing. And the reason why is this sort of poison pill of misinformation injected deep into the bloodstream of the debate on housing. Because who could possibly oppose, who here is against affordable housing? Presumably nobody's, on opinion polls typing in the little box going, oh no, what I want is more of that ludicrously unaffordable housing that we already have so much of. Nobody's doing that. But in actual fact, if you call it by its correct name, which is subsidised housing, it immediately prompts three obvious questions, which is what is the subsidy, who is paying it, and who is getting it? And then suddenly you're having automatically a much more honest debate about housing. And actually, I have a contractual obligation really to point out Sadiq Khan's failures. So the affordable housing programme, or subsidised housing programme as I would call it, the current period runs 2021 to 2026, is supposed to deliver roughly about 3,000 homes per year. So you might think, here we are in 2025, we're 4/5 years into that programme. So maybe it's delivered, I don't know, perhaps you think he's not very good, maybe you think he's done 10,000 homes in that time. In actual fact, he's done about 1,000, and nearly half of those are acquisitions. So in actual fact, it's about 550 completed new homes over a 5-year period. So there is a failure of delivery. But here's the thing. So in London, there's about 330,000 households on the household waiting list waiting for one of these social rent houses. And even if the policy were working, even if we had a competent mayor who was delivering the 3,000 homes per year, it's 110 years at that rate to fill the void. And so the question is, why can't we? Perhaps we should try to do more of these. So if you delve into what it means, to have a subsidy, there are two types of subsidy. One is a cross-subsidy, which, of course, in the world of property we call Section 106, because, of course, we do. And the problem there is if you have, say, 10% cross-subsidy, then you've got one subsidised flat and 9 market-rate units that would chip in to meet that subsidy. If, as the mayor wants, you have 35%, 50% even, that one subsidised unit, you're now trying to burden that cost onto just 2 or even 1 market price. And the economics of it don't work. So when developers say property building is not viable, this is one of the big issues they're talking about. And then the second form of subsidy is direct taxpayer subsidy. This is the so-called affordable homes program I was just mentioning. The subsidy per flat of these homes that Sadiq is not building, but if he were building them, it's about £222,000 per council house. And when he talks about we are building, I've just noticed my time is up. When he talks about how he is building more council houses than anyone before, he is building them at a cost of £222,000 per unit. So, the answer to the question, why don't we build enough of this social housing to actually build the social housing we need? The answer is it is simply not affordable. Whether you cross-subsidise or whether you direct taxpayer subsidise, it's not possible to solve a housing problem that way. So the policy framework we have, even if you had a competent mayor implementing it, is not capable of actually solving the problem. So it might be that we just need to build some more houses.
Thank you, Neil. Very interesting. And of course, because housing abides by the rules of the market, it's often the case that if you build unaffordable housing, so long as somebody moves into it, and so long as it's not their end of property, then people move up the housing ladder, and it does free up a property at the bottom of the ladder that is more affordable. So it's not the case that there's this complete dichotomy between affordable and unaffordable properties. Moving now on to Tom Darling from the Renters Reform Coalition, which stands up for the rights of tenants. I wonder what you think about all of this, Tom. Are there more bad tenants than bad landlords, and is the Renters' Rights Bill going to make the situation worse?
I don't think I'll bite on that question about tenants, but I'm not a conservative, small or big C, but I was hoping to make some maybe arguments that might be sympathetic to a conservative audience today as to why the private rented sector should be more regulated. And that bigger doesn't actually mean better. I heard Lord Jameson say the sector has doubled and that's got to be a good thing. I just profoundly disagree with that, and I'll touch on why. So the Renters Reform Coalition is a group of 19 organisations, including national housing charities and tenants' unions, and we've been pushing for reform of the private rented sector through first what was the then Housing Secretary Gove's Renters Reform Bill and what is now the Renters' Rights Bill. It was a shame, I think, to see the Conservatives parliamentarians marching through division lobbies to vote against reforms that were very similar to reforms that they had only 6 months prior supported and walked through the division lobbies to support. And I think I would have a bit of a warning for the party if it resiles from its commitment to a more regulated private rented sector, which I think it's going to do, which it looks like doing. As we've discussed, the private rented sector doubled between 2000 and 2014. Our argument would be that's been bad for tenants. The Resolution Foundation says that English housing is the worst quality and worst value for money of any high-income country in the world. And the private rented sector is the worst quality of and the most expensive amongst English housing. So that's just a bit of a level set in terms of what we're looking at in terms of housing in England. I think Conservatives would, I think, say that landlords must have property rights and these must be relatively unfettered, and therefore a landlord should be able to let to whoever they want on terms that they want, and we've had a big argument about fixed-term contracts. I think our argument would be that with constrained supply, and we've talked about house building, and that's definitely, I think everyone on this panel would probably agree that we are living in an environment where we haven't built enough houses for too long. Actually, what you're doing by deregulating and having an unregulated private rented sector is allowing the private rented sector to grow, and you're leading to more and more renters. So I just thought I would use a sort of distributional, hypothetical to try and get at the distributional issue, which is that would it be fair if 90% of people were renting off the other 10% in a society? You could get there via free, unfettered exchange of individuals, but I think Conservatives would still say that, hopefully would say that that's not a good sort of outcome for society. I'm a renter. Every month I transfer wealth away from myself via my biggest expense, which is my housing costs. I've seen the outfits out there of Mrs. Thatcher and some of the AI-generated answers you can get if you ask her a question. Well, I would be interested maybe to ask the AI, would she be happy with the fruits of the deregulation of private renting that took place in the 80s and 90s? I would argue that 4 in 10 former council right-to-buy homes being rented now for much more than they would be if they were council homes has not been good. With so many young people locked out of home ownership, I would say that hardly aligns with a property-owning democracy. Indeed, Lord George Young, one of Lord Jameson's colleagues, has been very supportive of our reforms. He was a housing minister under the major governments that introduced Section 21. So he's clearly not happy with the reforms. A couple more points. Sorry, I know I'm going on. Just one electoral point. I think Lord Gove knew that there was an electoral point that it's been touched on here that the Conservatives need an offer to young people. If you test a pro-landlord and a pro-renter sentiment in polling, as we've done, you get around 70% of the population, so well beyond renters themselves, saying they sympathise more with renters. And I think that there's no electoral joy to be found in being seen to be and being the explicitly landlord party. And then finally, I think more landlords are a brake on economic growth. I'm sure there are people in this room who are landlords who have invested savings and that's been their investment and perhaps their pension. I wouldn't judge that, but I would just say that we should be trying to create a system whereby we're incentivizing people to, say, invest in the stock market, and that would be a much more productive use of capital where it can be reinvested in the economy rather than into a sinkhole, which is landlordism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and dare I say, some points that I agree with, but perhaps we will get onto this. To wrap up this pre-Q&A part of the event, unless Henry decides to show up, I have been trying to get in touch with him, will be Timothy from Propertymark, which is a trade body for property agents. And I think a lot of the time when people are frustrated with the process of renting, a lot of their frustration is vented at letting agents and at property agents. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the role that they play and what government could do to help them do their role better and what the importance of the role is.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. So Propertymark is the UK's largest professional membership body for property agents. We've got 19,000 members across the UK, so agents working in residential sales, lettings, commercial agents, valuers, auctioneers. Some are doing land and new homes and some are doing block management, so covering the whole shebang. I mean, our raison d'etre is that we do think there should be minimum entry requirements for property agents to operate. Outside of Scotland, where you need a level 6, register with the Scottish Government and adhere to a statutory code of practice, or in Wales, where you need a minimum day's training course to work as a letting agent. There's no statutory minimum entry requirements or qualifications to operate. So in the absence of that, all of our members have signed up to be voluntary regulated, and we're going to do compliance visits, audits, and support them in their day-to-day work. So very much championing the good and outlawing the bad. And from a Conservative point of view, Heather Wheeler was the housing minister at the time, who worked with Lord Best and produced the Regulation of Property Agents report. And I think that did have momentum. It lost a bit of momentum with the pandemic, and various housing ministers came and went. But certainly the Conservatives started that process of regulating and looking at the spotlight of improving the quality of property agents. And we had an announcement from Labour earlier this week that they're going to again look at that and develop that forward, certainly through the home buying and selling process. But from our point of view, Propertymark's point of view, the first question is, well, why are rents high? Well, they're high because if it's not a supply crisis, it's a demand crisis. We regularly, survey our members. On an average, 9 applicants per property on a regular monthly basis. Tax is an issue. The whole thing, tax, everything leads back to tax, whether it's reforms to mortgage interest relief, Section 24, whether we have no options to right size, downsize, whichever way you look at it, for older people, and for young people to get on the housing ladder. The deposit and the stamp duty are some of the highest costs they will face. So we really need both major parties to look again at that. And we know the success of the stamp duty holiday during the COVID pandemic, which the Conservative Party helped, revive economic growth for the, continued growth for the country during that difficult period. Additional regulation costs money. Don't underestimate that to a landlord. And ultimately, the key to affordability in the private rental sector is more social housing, not affordable, social housing, as Neil has alluded to. But I think what we're still scrabbling around with is a sector, as tenants, landlords, agencies. I don't know what the strategy is. I got very excited when this current Labour government, as a policy wonk, said there will be a housing strategy. I haven't seen it yet, but there will be a housing. And I was like, jumping, this is great. I think one criticism of the Labour government, certainly through the Renters' Rights Bill, is no formal consultation. No formal consultation. The Conservatives, we had their white paper on the private rented sector. There's 7 government departments all interact with the private rented sector. They need to be coming together on a regular basis for welfare, justice, housing, Home Office, even right to rent checks. They need to be coming together to continually renew and set the agenda. And to some extent, the operating context is, well, I'm not excusing landlords, and I'm not excusing, or bad landlords, I'm not excusing bad agents. However, they're still not, we're the only country across the UK that doesn't have a landlord register. Northern Ireland has a landlord register, long-standing one. Even, it's not mandatory to have a written tenancy agreement, and we wonder what, you can rent on a handshake, and we wonder why there's problems. It's not compulsory to have an inventory at the start of the tenancy, or a check-in or check-out report, and we wonder why there's disputes, and you can't get your deposit back. And anyone can set up as a letting agent tomorrow. So there are some fundamental pillars that we need policymakers to put in place to give landlords half a chance, give tenants a quality standard before we get onto things like, removal of fixed-term tenancies in Section 21. And finally, I would say it is very difficult, as we'll all know, for current local authorities to enforce existing rules. So how the hell are they going to... there is a big concern, how are they going to enforce the raft and the heavy-handed raft of measures in the Renters' Rights Bill that the Labour government are bringing forward on the enforcement side.
Right. Thanks very much, Timothy. And before we move on to questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask, I mean, is it really just a demand issue? As Lord Jamieson has alluded to earlier, we've got some of the lowest per capita house building rates of any country in Europe. So surely there's also a problem with housing supply.
But are we building the right things in the right places? How many local plans have got targets linked to tenure? You know, a long-standing personal campaign around hashtag bring back the bungalow. You know, why are we building for what people need? And I think that's big discussion around targets, but are those targets linked to tenure?
Okay, thanks very much. So I will now open the floor up to the audience. Who's doing the mic? Okay. So let's just give Cyril a couple of seconds to pick up the microphone because he was taking pictures. And I think to begin with, I will take the gentleman in the front row. I'll go around the room in a kind of semicircle. The gentleman behind him and the lady behind him.
Chris Bowman from Tunbridge Wells. Yes, we need more houses built. Why did the Conservatives take away local housing targets? Secondly, Tom is right. We need to be investing in the stock market, not in houses. But the answer to that was sensible by the Conservative, altering the tax advantages that landlords had. But persecuting landlords and supporting bad tenants is not the answer. If you've got a block of flats and one tenant doesn't pay the rent and it takes a year to get them out, guess who they talk to in that year? The other tenants. Why should we pay rent if they don't pay rent? And this was very unconservative and, in my mind, as stupid as removing the housing targets. Would anybody on the panel agree?
Okay, thank you. But let's stick it to one question though.
A large number of landlords have one or two properties, and if you get a bad tenant, that's all your income gone. So if I've got a good tenant, I want them to stay forever. So the Section 21 to me is like the backstop, that if I get a really awful tenant, at least when at the end of the contract they can go easily. If I go through the proper channels, it takes forever, costs a fortune. I'm just waiting to see what comes in the budget, and I will be selling because my tenants are actually moving out just before the budget, so that's quite good timing for me. My neighbours have lost their rental property because their landlord's selling, because he feels it's just persecution. So landlords are going to desert the market if you're not careful.
Okay, so what's the question?
Question is, what do you think about bad tenants? How do we deal with them?
Okay.
Thank you. Marion Wooldridge. I am a landlord. So many things one could ask about, but I'll try and stick to a small number. First of all, I'd like to say to Tom, thank you for your comment about the stock market, because actually I agree with you on that in broad terms. When we started buying rental properties in 1994, we didn't know anything about the stock market, but we knew a lot about houses. So we went that way. And perhaps we should teach young people more about investing in the stock market, which might change some of these things. But we bought properties from 1994 to 2015. From 2017 to this year, we've been selling them. Why? Well, I think some of the reasons have become obvious. We started buying properties because we did not want to be a burden on anybody else in our old age. We wanted to be able to support ourselves. And that's why we started. My question is that why are we not dealing with this in a slightly different way and saying there are many advantages to younger people, perhaps well into their 30s, in renting? They're flexible in terms of their job. They've got no maintenance needs. Their landlord does all that. They can move around to a new job or a new area as they wish without too many problems, etc., etc. And if they look in terms of trying to buy when they're somewhat older, instead of must get on the housing market right now, perhaps it would alleviate a lot of mental anxiety and financial anxiety about all these young people who can't afford to buy a place. I mean, when I was young, you didn't actually buy somewhere early. You waited till you could afford it. So my question is, why are we not trying to actually put a different perspective on what young people see as the absolute panic to buy somewhere now?
Okay, thank you very much. So, why did the Tories take away housing targets, Section 21 and bad tenants, and are we not talking up the benefits of renting enough? Neil, I know you wanted to get on the first one.
So targets, I have a view about targets. Let me tell you a little story. MPs are not often well known outside their local constituency, but one of our, sorry to be parochial about London, one of our local MPs, a man called Keir Starmer, you might have heard him. So he's a local MP in Camden, right? So Camden, under the current London plan, has a housing target of just over 1,000. I think off the top of my head it's 1,054, but I could be wrong. They have actually averaged over the last 3 years about 500 completed properties, right? So that's how well that target's working. But it gets worse, because that's Keir Starmer's local council. Keir Starmer's government has just done this new assessment, 1.5 million houses over the Parliament. That breaks down to, in London, 88,000 homes per year. And the way that target is created is by looking at individual boroughs, what do they think the requirement is? And they think the requirement in Camden is just over 3,000. Right, so Camden is now, I'm picking on Camden, Camden is now producing a new local plan in which their new target is 750 per year, right? So this is how effective the target is. I don't particularly want to pick on Camden, I'll pick them a bit, but to be fair to Camden and to many other London boroughs, so what's the reason why that target's not working? What's the reason why they're not building those houses? Clearly, I should be clear, Labour MP, Labour Council, Labour Government, Labour Mayor, the Labour Party's view is that they need to be building all those houses. Why aren't they? And I think the blunt answer is because Camden Council, people in Camden, think that if they built 3,000 properties per year, it would make Camden worse. That new housing would be horrible, possibly ugly, possibly flammable, possibly not the kind of housing that people would enhance the borough. And the word that I'm fumbling towards is the word incentives. As people who think about liberal free market economics, rather than have a sort of communist-style tractor production target, maybe we should think about what are the incentives in the system that mean that even a borough that you would think is quite tightly politically aligned with the Labour government and its target regime on housing is absolutely, they're taking the mickey, aren't they, really, with what they're doing. And the reason they're doing it is because they just think their housing will make it worse. So actually the thing to think about is, in what way does revenue and economic benefit of new housing supply in a borough, or just a council, let's say outside London, how does that actually create a benefit for the council and for the people in that area? Because if actually that happened, if they felt building 3,000 new homes a year would make people in Camden better off, you wouldn't need a tractor production number and a big target on a spreadsheet somewhere. They would be doing it. Maybe they'd be building 4,000 or 5,000. And I think we really have to try and get away from this socialist mentality of targets and try and think about what are the incentives in the system that mean that people are, it's against their interest to do the thing that in theory is in our interest.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Does anybody want to pick up the tenant question?
I can't remember all of them, but I think there's several answers. I do actually want to pick up one thing on Tom. The Conservatives are not the party of the landlords. We are the party of residents and voters, some of whom are landlords and some of whom are tenants. And actually the biggest thing that we are is we want to give people a stake in society. And the easiest way to get a stake in society is to have your own home. So that's the key thing for us. But not everybody is going to have their own home for a variety of reasons. One, because I think somebody mentioned it, they're going to be transient. They may be working in London for a couple of years. They don't want to buy a house because they're going to live long term in Birmingham or Manchester or wherever. There is a role for the private market, and we need that to be a successful role, and we need tenants to have secure, reasonable prices, and we need it to be attractive to the investors. But actually, fundamentally, we need every part of the housing market to be working. And that means we need the right, and as Neil has said, the right incentives to make things work. And I actually agree with Neil on targets. There's no point in having a target unless you have a mechanism for delivering it. And in an urban area, there are virtually no mechanisms to oblige someone to hit that target. And maybe incentives is the right way to do it, but no one in London virtually is hitting their targets other than a few places like Tower Hamlets. And there are reasons for that. Whereas outside London, like Central Bedfordshire, we've hit our targets. Now, I'm going to do a plug for Central Bedfordshire because somebody mentioned social housing. When I became leader of Central Bedfordshire, we had 120-odd families in temporary accommodation and in bed and breakfast. When I left, we had none. And we did that because we built housing, we built our own temporary housing, and we worked really hard on it. Now, we've since been taken over by another group of individuals, and we have a load of people in bed and breakfast again, because they were not doing that policy. In terms of right to buy your own home, Central Bedfordshire, for the last 14 years we were running it, we built more council houses than we sold. And we were able to do that because we reinvested the proceeds. My biggest issue with the Thatcher reforms was about reinvesting the proceeds. It was not the principle of allowing someone to buy their own home, which has been a huge uplift for a number of people. It is the then reinvest those proceeds to build another home. And that way, for every house you sell, you get another house. That's 2 houses. If somebody stays in that house, you only have 1 house. I'd much rather have 1 new affordable, social rented, whatever you call it, and 1 person owning their own home than having just the 1 house. 2 for 1 sounds good to me.
Very good. And I know, Timothy, you wanted to come in as well.
Well, I just think on the bad tenant or bad landlord, tenant good argument is terrible, really. It's not the sort of debate that we want, and I just think in reality it doesn't bear out. So language is really important, and I do think we did have that more balanced debate under the Conservatives. I don't think the Labour government have helped that. There is, as Lord Jameson's alluded to, a lot of mud thrown that, the landlord lobby and the Lords. Well, you could create a long list of Labour MPs who previously worked for Shelter or have a family member or partner who worked for Shelter, and when we've approached them for meetings, hasn't necessarily been forthcoming. So, if the sector is so bad, come on board and join our campaign to regulate agents and drive standards up. But I think language is important. We need to move away from that. But ultimately, we want enforcement. We want a level playing field. We want to get rid of bad landlords, and where bad tenants are causing social issues in property, they need to be removed. So the system's got to work. A couple more final points. Again, I've made the point around tax. I don't think we quite understand what we want from landlords, what we want from properties, and we've long called for review into all costs and taxes impacting private landlords to better understand that. Should it be taxed like a business? Some of it is, some of it isn't. Some of the reliefs, incentives. I do think that needs to be looked at. One thing I think the Conservatives did do is introduce we will have a short-term lets register or a new planning use class under the Levelling Up Act, yet to be implemented. But outside of London, where there's a voluntary 90-day rule, short-term lets, is another area that's exploited and sort of, I think, doesn't help with the problem. But ultimately, I think one of the big concerns around Section 21 is, landlords, agents use it as a last, resort, and often, and I think the big concern at the moment is around courts' capacity for the new world. And ultimately, the Conservatives in the previous Renters Reform Bill put in a trigger that, the rules will come, Section 21 will be abolished when, court reform, the courts are fit for purpose. All we've had from the Labour government is it will be digitised, we've sorted it, and we don't know, we haven't got any further detail. So one thing we've actually done is we've been campaigning with the High Court Enforcement Officers body, with the NRLA, trying to get looking at bailiffs, shortages in the system, and the automatic right to a High Court Enforcement Officer to speed things up. So, language, tax, the courts, and enforcement are all key to this.
And I know, Tom, you wanted to come in quickly as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just on the bad tenants point and Section 21, I think the problem is I believe you when you say you would like to keep a good tenant as a landlord, but I think for a lot of landlords, Section 21 isn't a last resort, and we have a lot of evidence of it being sort of held over tenants and used in a retaliatory way if they ask for repairs. There are already eviction grounds for antisocial behaviour of various gradations, and so if you have a tenant with a criminal conviction, say, you can seek to have them evicted through the court system. So there are eviction grounds, and there are still ways under the reforms for landlords to regain possession of their property. On your point about people renting into their 30s, I mean, that's what was underpinning this whole rental reform agenda, and indeed I think was behind Lord Gove's efforts to reform the sector, a recognition of the fact that there are more people living into the rented sector in their 30s, in their 40s. So if you're 32, say, and you're a young couple in the private rented sector, and you're right on the breadline, and you know that you could be evicted with 2 months' notice at any moment, are you going to be wanting to start a family? Is that a good environment in which to be wanting to try and get pregnant? I think that I know that birth rates is a big issue that Conservatives care about, and I think that a more regulated private rented sector is a good way to facilitate people who are stuck in the private rented sector to start families. And the final point I was going to make, I have forgotten.
Oh wow, very many questions, but I've promised...
Oh, sorry, just to defend Shelter, who are a Renters Reform Coalition member. I think there's a big difference between someone who used to work at a charity and someone who has an active financial interest and is earning money from being a landlord in Parliament. There's a big difference there in terms of what sort of level of declaration is required, I think.
Sorry, can I just come back on your point?
Apologies, we've got very many questions, so...
Come back on Tom's point. I think my point was that our whole atmosphere around this needs to change. It's not just one point that says it's a good thing to rent for a bit longer sometimes, but the whole thing needs to change so that it's easier and better to rent.
Okay, thank you. So I'm now going to take 4 questions, and I would ask you that you keep them to one short sentence, no embedded clauses, no hidden statements, okay?
No semicolons.
No semicolons, no punctuation marks at all, as a matter of fact. There's a gentleman there at the front row whom I've promised to take his question.
Thank you. My name's Darshan Sangha. I'm a district councillor in Epping Forest Council. I'm also a letting agent for the last 25 years. I've got a couple of points I really would like to share with you.
Okay, no.
Just
One
okay,
point, one point
I'll
and one
focus.
sentence.
I'll focus on one. Landlords are leaving the market. That is happening. My question to each of the panel members here is: the Labour Party are not listening to what's happening, and just to say,
Okay, could you
we need
go
to
to your
change the
question, please?
culture. So, what are you going to be saying to the Labour government about changing the way they are approaching the PRS sector? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The lady behind him, with red hair.
I have tenants that I've had for 15 years. They're on the local housing rate. They don't get charged extra. They're in Oxford. Oxford have recently come to me and said, I've got to be licensed. I'm licensed, and they've come and done an inspection. The toilet, they have decided, has to have a separate hand basin in it. There's no room for it, so they want me to replace the toilet to put one with a separate hand basin in it. No council house that they own has that done to it, but I'm being forced to. And secondly, if you reduce capital gains, I will get out the market.
Okay, the gentleman behind her.
Yes, just quickly, looking at students, when students exit their the first year, when they go into their first year of halls of residence, they encounter the private landed sector. How will the Renters' Right Bill, or any bill, protect them so they'll get their deposit back and they won't be so reliant on the bank of mum and dad? Because the panel just touched on the income going to landlords, and I feel that the students need to be protected if we want to win the young person's vote. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And the lady at the very back. There will be another round of questions, so don't be too worried.
I'm Rebecca Montague. I'm the Research Director at the Social Market Foundation. We had an event yesterday on how the Conservatives can try to win back the youth vote. I suppose I had 2 questions related to that for this panel, which is, why do you think when it comes to the housing sector, young people didn't vote Conservative in large numbers last election? And what would be the one policy on housing that you think could cause younger people, I'd also say particularly young women, because young women are the least likely to try to get back those voters, basically.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got, what would you say to Labour? We've got capital gains tax, we've got student letting, and we've got one housing policy for young women. Who would like to go first?
Shall I kick off? I was just declare an interest. As of a couple of weeks ago, I am one of those parents paying student accommodation. But it's really lovely, so that's great. I particularly want to pick up the final. I won't do that. I think I'm going through all of the questions superficially, but I would like to pick up the point about what we would say to young people, because I briefly mentioned that at the beginning. You know, the fact is in London, majority of people, and in particular majority of people under, say, I don't know, 40 or 45, overwhelmingly those people are renting. And as I said at the beginning, if we're not offering people in that age range who are renters something for what is the biggest single cost they have, then you know, it shouldn't be a surprise that they don't vote for us. I think I would say two things. Number one, although this session is particularly about private rented sector, as Lord Jameson said at the beginning, it actually is largely just about fundamentally a supply issue in housing, and that was what I sort of in my whistle-stop tour of the Mad Hatter's Tea Party at the beginning. We have got to tackle the problem of supply, and talking about doing it in terms of so-called affordable, i.e. subsidised housing, doesn't work. We've got to deliver supply in order to actually bring down rents. And I perhaps ought to say this is politically challenging, perhaps for younger people, but it's very difficult for us to increase in supply in housing to bring down rents if you also have a massive increase in the number of people who come to make their home in the UK. But I actually think, just to sound like an old fogey, we have to bring back the 90s, and this is when I was a student. The issue, well, the music was great. That was obviously the big thing. But what we had in the 90s, and just to be serious for a moment, what we had in the 90s was a sense of optimism. You know, wages were rising. There was economic growth. There was a sense of prosperity. We'd had, you know, Ken Clarke as Chancellor for a long period of time had delivered a long period of economic growth. Housing was affordable, even though people at the time grumbled that it wasn't. It actually was. And all of those things, which in politics we used to call the feel-good factor, you know, this was how governments win elections, feel-good factor, those are the things that actually, not just young people, but older people as well, but particularly younger people who actually have never experienced what the world is like when there's this general improving sense of prosperity. And you know, I look around the room, there are some people who are of an age that will remember that. We have got to bring that sense of optimism back, and not just the feeling of optimism, but the reality of economic growth and improving prosperity. Ultimately, that is how political parties win elections, and I think young people have been badly shortchanged by actually never experiencing it. And I think perhaps if they did experience it for a bit, if the Conservatives could deliver it, I think that would be how they would reward us with their vote.
Thanks, Neil. Yes, Lord Jameson, if you could come in.
I'm going to say pretty much the same thing. The issue we have with all housing is it's too expensive to buy, too expensive to rent, too expensive if you're a student. That is because we do not have enough supply, and yes, there is also a tangent issue of demand. You know, when we have enough housing, rents will be lower, security will be better, people will have the opportunity to buy their own home, to have a stake in society. That will mean some difficult choices. We mentioned the issue of Camden. 62% of Camden is in a conservation area. You know, are we going to make some difficult choices around conservation areas? But those are the difficult choices. But we need to have the number of homes that our population needs, and we don't. And that's why the whole gamut, whether it's social, affordable, private, or to buy, is too expensive. And that's the one policy change.
And yes, Tom, very, very quickly.
I'll just come in. There were a couple of questions, I think, on this idea of landlords potentially leaving the sector. And I would say, first, there's no evidence that the private rented sector has reduced in size at all. No, I mean, you might read NRLA-sponsored surveys. If that's where you're getting your information, I can understand why you'd be surprised. But in terms of the English Housing Survey, there's no evidence that the sector has reduced in size. But I would say, I mean, it would be our view that the private rented sector decreasing in size is not necessarily a bad thing. And obviously we've talked about we need more supply generally of homes, but I think the actual private rented sector being smaller would not necessarily be a bad thing, because what happens when a landlord sells their home? Who buys it? It doesn't sink into the ground. There's no dynamite put underneath it so that the bricks fall into the ground. Someone is going to end up living there, and it's either going to be a first-time buyer. It'll either be sold to another landlord, or it will be used. It'll be bought by the council. Where I do agree is that we need regulation of short-term lets, because then you are genuinely losing the home from the supply of homes that people in society are living in.
A good point. I think on the next round of questions, maybe.
It's just a quick point, which is where this whole point is the idea that, you know, that property still exists is absolutely correct. But actually, one of the ways to get more homes built is for investors to do buy-to-let, buying new homes, increasing the demand for those new homes, allowing more new homes to be built. So there is a role, just as there is a role in social housing to help drive new demand by building social houses, there is a role for the private rented sector to drive demand to enable more housing to be built. So it isn't a single-sized cake and it's a share of the cake. There is an element of how can we make the cake bigger, how can we have more houses built, and there is a role for the private rental sector to drive up more building of homes.
And I've just come in on that, Bartek. Is that okay?
Very, very quickly.
Very quickly. Well, I think it goes back to the point made about vision and strategy, and I would look to Scotland and the private rental sector in Scotland if you want to potentially look at the vision for the future. It's high taxes, 8%. 8% if you're a landlord and you want to buy a buy-to-let property. You pay 8% on land building transaction tax. Restrictive legislation, they've removed the fixed-term tenancies, have periodic tenancies. And what does that mean? There's a homelessness crisis in the student sector in many student cities in Scotland. They just can't access the property. And what has that led to? High rents. And what does that mean? Rent control, because they think that's to solve it. So, and in order to temper the rent control, what are they doing? They're exempting institutional investors. And institutional investors, on average, build to rent. We need build to rent. We need a healthy mix, as Lord James was saying. But on average, their rents are higher. 70% of landlords in Scotland have one property. That is the bulk of it. So we've got to move away from this us versus them. We need a healthy mix. We need a vision and a strategy from our policymakers.
Thanks, Timothy. A good point about rent controls. Now, because we're running out of time, I would ask that you direct your question towards one specific member of the panel so they don't all feel tempted to answer it. Let's ask the young-ish gentleman in the fourth row.
We've got the same question.
Okay, perfect.
EPC.
This is what I meant.
EPC, I believe, is defunct, right? It's not fit for purpose. In the next 2 years, we've got 3.6 million private rented properties falling in that category. We're not going to hit that, and it's going to be a catastrophe. What's the answer to that?
And who would you like to answer it?
Whoever's
Okay, well, we can maybe pick later. On the other side, the gentleman there in the back.
Hi, Eamon Gannon, private landlord. What I see have happened, which the past government of the Tories have done and what Labour are going to do, they're going to put all properties into institutions like BlackRock. BlackRock can deduct any charges, any costs, and allow them to have a profitable side. Private landlords, we cannot deduct anything off our costs. How are you happy that private landlords are being driven out and given to the BlackRocks, the Blackstones of international investors?
Thank you. Lady here in the very front row.
Hi. Back in the 90s, I was a self-employed contractor, and I was doing 2 to 3 year contracts in various parts of the UK. I was able to refinance my house and buy a flat which is cheaper than renting. I ended up with 3 flats. I sold one of them because the hassle, and I've got 2 left, and with the Renters' Rights Bill, I'm seriously wondering whether it's worthwhile keeping them because I can replace that income quite easily from the stock market.
Okay, what's your question?
But my question is one of the small things we can do is to allow landlords to put solar panels on the roof and share the proceeds with their tenants. It's a difficult thing to do because a shared occupancy creates all sorts of problems, but it would benefit everybody.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question from the lady in the second row.
Hello, thank you for that. I'm a buy-to-let landlord. I'm also a district councillor. My real concern is that I quite understand that we ought to improve the standards within the building, so the MEES, the EPC which has been referred to. But there is a real problem when you've got tenants living there for a long time. The opportunity to go in, to do the refurbishments which are required, and I'm going to say that in some of the properties I have exactly the same property as Wandsworth Council particularly might have, but they are not required to do it for their own property. So the private landlords are having their properties at a higher standard than those in the social or affordable sector. Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So we've got energy efficiency, solar panels, and BlackRock. If
talk on
everybody
that
can pick only one question, because we're running out of
I'll
time.
do BlackRock if I may.
I'll do energy efficient.
Okay, so then Tom will do the last one.
So, listen, there is a very important role for institutional investors, but there is a very important role for single landlords. I come from a rural area. BlackRock is not going to invest in little villages in central Bedfordshire because they don't want a little cottage here and a cottage there. That is what a single landlord who may have one or two properties are. We've got to respect and understand those two different markets. Now, in London, where you actually may want somebody to buy almost a whole block of flats and rent them out, that's not a single mum and pop landlord. That is a BlackRock or an LNG or whoever. So we need both, and we particularly in the rural area need the smaller landlord because it's just not suitable for the institutional investor.
Thank you. Timothy?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, energy performance certificates, they'll still remain. You know, you need one when a property's built, sold and rented. They are going to change the methodology next year, so they'll kind of look a bit differently around the rating. But in terms of minimum energy efficiency standards, I mean, Propertymark's view is that a one-size-fits-all for the 18 different archetypes of property we have across the country just isn't going to cut it, and you're going to lose more property from the private sector, or you need a very good exemptions regime. The previous energy minister, when I had a conversation with her, who's now in the housing department, I said, how are landlords going to pay for all of these energy efficiency improvements? And she said landlords will pay through their savings. So that's the mentality we've got to get away from. The UK government think it will cost an average 6k, and the cost cap is going to rise to £15,000 before we can register an exemption. So things like the Green Deal, I think Lord Jameson might remember, was that the split incentive. The issue is the landlord owns the property, the tenant pays the bills. We've got to do something quite clever to sort something there that means that the landlord can invest in the property and see the reduction in bills to help the tenants. But finally, yeah, ultimately, as Lord James said, landlords are providers, must be treated so. I know a local authority in Warwickshire that without fail has got 2,000 council housing, and without fail, every 5 years they'll change the boilers, whether they're working or not, in that 2,000 stock. That's great. We want to support those tenants. But private landlords can't do that. Or they can't do that without some sort of incentives from the government. So we've got to change the language. We've got to treat them as housing providers and help them with these measures.
Thank you, Timothy. And Tom?
Yeah, just on that point, so the energy efficiency of the social rented sector is much, much higher than the private rented sector. And that's
They've had billions of pounds of eco-funding to the social rented sector. Let's have some of that money in the private rented sector.
I'm not saying they haven't,
Standards
but
rise.
because, and they can, obviously, they can take decisions on a much longer term sort of time horizon.
They have supply chains, they have maintenance teams.
They also
private
charge
landlords
much
don't
lower
have
rent.
Precisely. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we don't think having a bigger social rented sector and a smaller private rented sector would be the worst thing in the world.
Thank you, Tom. And I know, Neil, you said you wanted to add a couple of sentences.
Yeah, so on this point that's come up a few times about regulation, so regulation of landlords driving consolidation in the sector, the observation I would make is that when we talk about house building, one of the problems often identified is that you've got this very consolidated sector, relatively fewer small and medium builders, and actually this creates a problem of supply because you get a sort of a cartel effect. And if we're creating that in rental, that doesn't seem like a good thing. And very quickly on your point about energy efficiency, I think this is an interesting problem that if you're an owner-occupier, you would spend the capital to invest in energy efficient measures in your home, and you would then get the benefit in a lower bill. If you have a private rented situation, it would be the landlord who would pay the capital cost and the tenant who would have the saving on their electricity bill, and that's a pretty obvious, textbook case of what economists would call market failure. And I don't know that anyone has really thought how we fix that, but it's pretty urgent if we're going to tackle emissions and energy efficiency.
We've got two houses sharing the roof. That's difficult.
Okay. Thank you very much, Neil. And this is all we have time for today at this event. I'm conscious that I've kept you here for a couple of minutes longer than I should have, but thank you for staying with us. This is a very fun event to do each year because we always get a really lively debate from people with kind of very different interests and very different points of view. If you're interested in becoming a member of Bright Blue, then please speak to one of our team members. You can see Cyril there in the back with voluminous blonde hair. And please read our publications. If you go on our website, brightblue.org.uk, we've published loads about housing, we've published loads about the private rental sector, including an essay collection to do with shelter called Home Advantage. Yeah, hopefully see you at more Bright Blue events in the future. Thank you again for coming.